always says this, and then when he's not here, I do it. He's always like, oh God, I forgot to do this. Oh, like, since he does it all the time.
Yeah, he's got that. He's got me all set up.
Nobody actually wants me to be over here.
We're going to get started today. Thank you all for coming. And if you haven't been here before, welcome to the archives. And today we have Crystal Alegria with us from Bozeman and the Extreme History Project. She is from Livingston but lives in Bozeman. And today her presentation, Stories in Stone, Decoding Headstone Symbols and the Reflection of Community, is a presentation that explores the rich symbolism etched into headstones and their significance in understanding the cultural, historical, and spiritual fabric of a community. By decoding the motifs, designs, and inscriptions found in cemeteries, we can better understand the stories these stones tell us about community values. This program highlights how headstone symbolism serves as a visual language connecting us to the lives and legacies of those who came before. Again, thank you, Crystal. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks everyone. I'm so excited to be here today to talk to you all about cemeteries and cemetery symbolism, one of my very favorite things. So I love to wander through historic cemeteries. I love to look at the headstones and read the dates and the names, and of course look at the symbols and hear the birds singing and see the landscape and look at all the beautiful flowers and cemeteries. And I'm sure a lot of you love to do those same things as well, and that's maybe why you're here today. So you know there's a name for us. We're called taphophiles. Has anyone ever heard that before, that word taphophile? A couple of you have. So taphophile has its root in taphos, which means grave or tomb. So it's just someone who loves graves or tombs. So we're all taphophiles in this room today, I think, and so taphophiles unite. So I have a question. I have another question for you, or I have a question for you. Why do all of you think cemeteries are important? And even if you're not a taphophile, even if you don't like to wander through cemeteries all the time like I do, why do you think they are important to us as a community? Anyone have any ideas or thoughs?
So people can, after they're gone, at least there's something to present their life, or for somebody like you to go back to the archives to research on their lives.
Yeah, exactly. So if you guys didn't hear, it's that idea that there's kind of a remembrance of that person, or something that kind of marks that person's place in time, that they were here, and that we can go back and study who that person was and what they thought was important and how they lived their life. Yes, very much so. Anyone else want to add to that? Yeah.
They're a great historical asset.
Yes, they're a huge historical asset. So I call cemeteries outdoor museums, because that's basically what they are, or an outdoor archives. You can go into these places and you can learn so much about the people who lived in this place before we did. So yeah, and someone over here said so much history in those places. So yeah, all those things, they really also reflect a community's values, don't they? And both past and present, because cemeteries to me are sort of living places. We as living people go into them to learn and to understand those people who came before us. So outdoor museums. This is a picture of me in Salem, Massachusetts, looking at a very old headstone from the 1700s, I think it was. So kind of a different shape and different motifs than the headstones we have here today, but very beautiful headstones along the East Coast. I'm not going to talk about as much about those. I'm going to talk today more about our settler or pioneer cemeteries that we have here in Montana and in the West. But before I do that, I want to go way back in time and talk about one of our earliest burial sites that was dated to about 12,500 years ago. And there was probably burials before this one, but this is the earliest burial that we know of currently in Montana. And this is today called the Anzac site, or the Anzac Child Burial Site. And this was a burial location for a little boy. And we know that through DNA research. But how this site came to be found was just basically by accident. So in the 1960s, a couple gentlemen were getting some backfill dirt with a backhoe. They were digging into this embankment here just to get some fill dirt. And as they were doing that, they noticed all of a sudden that all these artifacts kind of came spilling out of this embankment. And so they turned off the backhoe and they went over and they looked and they saw hundreds of artifacts. And they were beautiful. Here's a picture of those artifacts right here, some of them. And they were spear points, very large, some of them even this big. So some of them small, but some of them very large. And so they knew this was significant and important, so they called a local archaeologist to come in. And he came in and he noticed that not only were there artifacts, there were human remains kind of interspersed within this collection or this cache. And so they did, over the years, they've done many studies on these artifacts and the human remains included amongst these artifacts, and found out, like I said, that it was a burial for a small child who was buried about 12,500 years ago, near what is today Wilsall, Montana, so basically in our backyard. And so this is a hugely important, significant archaeological site, not just for us in Montana, but for the whole United States and the world. So if you're an Anthropology 101 student going to MSU or U of M or any university in the nation, you learn about this site. It's that significant. And so these artifacts are, not all of them, but a lot of them are at the Montana Historical Society. So when they open back up this fall, make sure to go and have a look. They're amazing artifacts. The artifacts are in museum collections or privately held. The human remains that I spoke about of the little boy have been reinterred somewhere along this creek, right in the same area. They were reinterred a few years ago. So that's kind of one of our oldest cemeteries or grave sites or burial sites. And now we're going to focus on things a little more recent. So we're going to talk now about some settler community cemeteries, so more 19th and 20th century cemeteries. And we're going to really kind of focus in on that idea of symbols. So I want us to all kind of think about symbols a little bit. And if someone wants to raise their hand and just tell me, what is a symbol? What is a symbol? Yes?
Something that represents part of that person's life.
Okay, yes, exactly. So a symbol is something that represents something else. And symbols are really interesting. Sometimes symbols change over time. Sometimes symbols are very unique to a culture. Sometimes symbols are very unique just to one certain part of a culture. So we're going to look at some symbols. We're going to have some fun. We're going to look at some symbols. And I want you to just tell me what this symbol is that you see on the screen here. What is that one? Peace. That one is easy, isn't it? Everyone kind of got that. I saw almost everyone say that. Okay, so they're going to get a little bit harder as we go. So what is that one? Yeah, so that's the on-off signal. So it's kind of originates from that idea of a 0 and a 1, and the 1 is kind of the closed circuit and the 0 is the open circuit. So you know that if you see this, if you push it, whatever it is turns off or turns on, right? Exactly. Okay, this one's pretty easy too. What is that? Starbucks, okay. Yeah, even if you're not a big coffee drinker, you probably still know what the symbol is. Even if you've never been to a Starbucks, you probably still recognize this symbol. It's very cross-culture. And now this symbol has become worldwide known, not just the United States, but known throughout the world. Okay, this one might get a little tougher. What's that one? Oh, very good, very good. People from my generation know this one. Yeah, so this is the sign for Prince, the recording artist Prince, who was really popular. Oh yeah, say that again. Formerly known as Prince, yes, exactly. So Prince went through this stage. He was in an argument with his recording company, and so he said, I'm not going to be known by the name Prince anymore, I'm going to be known with this symbol. And so it was really hard for us to talk during those years because we had to kind of talk about him using the symbol. But the symbol stands for love, which was a mashup of gender symbols for man and woman. And so that Prince came up with this. But in the year 2000, he kind of started this in 1993. But in the year 2000, he said, oh, heck with the symbol, I'm going back to Prince. So we were like, whew, phew. Okay, and so this one, what is this one?
Deathly Hallows.
Deathly Hallows. Okay, so the younger folks in the room kind of know this symbol. And so what is the Deathly Hallows from?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, right. So if you're a big Harry Potter fan, you would know this. If you, and so you can kind of see how even age differences or culture differences, we have different symbols that mean different things. So this is, if you were a big Harry Potter fan, you would have probably known this instantly. Okay, so, but symbols change over time as well. So some of the symbols that we're going to see on these headstones today mean something different today than they did in the 19th century. And, you know, that's not even, things change in our lifetimes as well. So this sign, or this symbol right here, pre-2007, you probably would have called this a pound sign or a number sign. But now, you probably call this a hashtag. So it got a whole new meaning in 2007. And now we use it for so many different, so for something completely different than we did pre-2007. So symbols can change really quickly as well. Okay, so are you ready to see some headstone symbolism? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about some of the symbols on headstones. And I wanted to start with flowers and plants because I think this is the most prominent symbolism that we have on headstones from that 19th, 20th century time period, kind of the Victorian time period is where we're going to be focusing in today, kind of that 1860s to 1920s era here in Montana and in the West. And so flowers are fascinating and beautiful as well, and the plants that we see on these headstones. So we're going to start over here with wheat because we see a lot of wheat in Montana because, of course, we are an agriculturally based state, and we grow a lot of grains here, and wheat being one of those grains that we grow quite a bit of. So you see a lot of wheat on headstones, and it's usually this kind of looks like this, a sheaf of wheat, and that represents that someone lived to a ripe old age, and that they were harvested. It's kind of a weird word or term to use, but they were harvested and then resurrected and lived a long and fruitful life. So that's kind of what wheat symbolizes if you see it on the top, and it's usually on the top of the headstone there. Well, not always. The calla lily, this is a beautiful symbol of a calla lily, and lilies in general, whether it's a calla lily or an Easter lily, or a lily of the valley, often mean purity. They're that beautiful white color, and they often symbol purity. The calla lily also symbolizes beauty, purity and beauty. And you often see the calla lily on women's graves, and that, and sometimes on graves of a couple. So it also sometimes symbolizes that idea of marriage. Also, what is this one right down here? Can you tell what that is?
Lily of the Valley.
Lily of the Valley, yeah. And you see a lot of lily of the valleys here in Butte and in Deer Lodge cemeteries. I've noticed them. I don't see very many lily of the valleys in the Bozeman cemetery. So it's kind of strange how some cemeteries really take some symbols and run with them. The lily of the valley really symbolizes that idea of that association with the Virgin Mary, because there is this story that the Virgin Mary's tears turned into the lily of the valley when she was at Jesus's resurrection, and so that is what symbolizes that idea of Mary and virginity, kind of that Virgin Mother. And so you'll notice when I'm talking today that a lot of the the symbols are kind of going to be based in Christianity. That's just because that's the majority of the symbolism within the cemeteries, within the settler cemeteries. It's not the entire, there's a lot of Jewish symbolism in our cemeteries in Montana as well. But today I'm kind of focusing in on the Christian symbology. Also here we have the ivy. So do you see the little ivy kind of clinging here? And ivy is really prominent in cemeteries. And ivy symbolizes, where's our ivy? Do I have it on there? The Holy Trinity. So the ivy usually has the 3 leaves to it, and that symbolizes the Holy Trinity. But ivy is an evergreen plant. It stays green throughout the year. So it kind of symbolizes that idea of friendship. It also clings to whatever it's climbing up, as friends cling to each other during hard times, especially during the death of a loved one. So ivy is often represented to kind of symbolize that idea of close friendship. Let's see, what else do we have? Up here, the laurel wreath. And the laurel wreath kind of symbolizes that idea of victory over death. And so, of course, in the ancient games, when people won the race, they would be crowned with a wreath of laurel. And so that's kind of the same idea, that in death you're crowned with victory of going to heaven. And the laurel wreaths are often right at the top of the headstone, symbolizing that idea of being crowned on the head. So that is, I mean, I could talk forever about plants. This is just a few. So when you go out to cemeteries, look and see all the different plants on headstones. But one of the reasons that flowers are so associated with funerals and on headstones is because at the funeral itself, there were often flowers near the body. And the reason is just a practical reason for this, because oftentimes, especially during the Victorian time period, you would lay the person out in your parlor or in your home, and they would be there for a couple days. And sometimes it would get a little smelly. And so if you had really potent flowers like Easter lilies there, that would really help with the smell. And so flowers really served just that purpose. But then they became incorporated over time into the funeral itself and onto the headstones. So this is a great photograph from Miles City, taken in 1906, with that really potent smelling Easter lily next to the person being laid out in the living room, it looks like. Okay, so next we're going to go to another symbol that I see all the time in cemeteries. And you might not have really noticed this symbol before, but now that I've talked about it, you're probably going to see these all over the graveyard. And that is hands. Hands. So hands are something that are on a lot of headstones. And of course, that's because to us, our hands are one of the most important things. We do everything with our hands, don't we? And so why not? Why not put them on our headstones? And so you'll see hands in a lot of different ways represented symbolically on headstones. And so the most common is the finger pointing up. What do you think that means? Yeah, the person's going upwards to heaven. Yes. But sometimes you will see the finger pointing down. Now, that's not what you think. It's not that the person's going down. That just means that the hand of God is coming down and plucking the person up to heaven. So if you see the finger pointing down, don't get worried. So we have the finger pointing up. We have the clasped hands, or the hands kind of together, joined together. And this means a few different things. Sometimes it means that the hand of God is coming to take the person to heaven, and so they're grabbing their hand to take them to heaven. Sometimes it means that a husband and wife are joined together in eternity, and we call that the marital handshake. And so the way to see if it's a man and a woman, or a husband and a wife, is sometimes you'll see a very manly cuff. You can see the very manly cuff over here on the right, and the very feminine cuff over here on the left. So that probably tells us this, that there's Harry was probably married to his wife who died, and they're now in heaven together. Sometimes we'll see this little finger pointing out right here, and that means that that person was a Mason. So if the finger is pointing out of the handshake, that means that the man was a Mason. And I've never seen this in Montana, but I've seen it in other places where there's two fingers pointing out. So within the handshake, there's two fingers pointing out, and that probably means the man was a Mason and the wife was Order of the Eastern Star, which is the woman's auxiliary. So if you see one of those, let me know. And then the heart in the hand just means that that person was very charitable. They were a very charitable person. And also the Odd Fellows, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, had this, used this on their headstones as well to signify that they were an odd fellow. Okay, and then the finger pointing up into the crown just is another symbol, another Christian symbol of that the person is going up to heaven, and that crown kind of symbolizes the King of Kings, and that idea. So those are the hands. So look for a hand when you're out in the cemetery next. Okay, let's go and talk about the gates ajar. So I noticed that the archives, if you didn't look at the exhibit on your way in, make sure to look at the exhibit on your way out, because it's a really nice exhibit that it has been put together on burials in Butte. And I noticed that on one of the front what do you call those? Panels. And as you come in, they have a gates ajar, really beautiful gates ajar symbolism. Now, the gates ajar symbolism is really fascinating to me, and I love it, so I want to talk a little bit about it. So this gates ajar symbol is a direct result of a novel. This novel right over here called The Gates Ajar that was published in 1868 by a woman whose name was Elizabeth Stuart Phelps. And the story follows a young woman in this novel who is grieving the loss of her brother who died in the Civil War. And of course, this novel was published right after the Civil War in 1868. The war finished in 1865. So in the novel, this young woman finds solace from an aunt who tells her that the gates of heaven are not closed, but always remain open ajar. That way, souls can pass back and forth between heaven and earth. And in this way, loved ones who have passed are always able to observe friends and family among the living. And, just think about this time in our history where people had lost sons and they had lost fathers and brothers. And so this idea of the gates ajar, where you could still somehow communicate with that person on the other side, really took root. And so the gates ajar, you can see that there's the gates and there's heaven up here, and there's just this little opening that you can kind of slip through to maybe talk or communicate with your loved one on the other side. So it's a really neat idea. But headstones still today have the gates ajar on them. So I think this meaning of this has kind of been lost, but that is the origin story of the gates ajar. Okay. Tree stones. How many of you seen a tree stone? Okay, they're beautiful, they're amazing. Tree stones were really popular at the end, the 1890s to around the 1910s, and they were carved from limestone often, and not one tree stone is the same. They are all a little bit different. So if you ever see one kind of in a cemetery off in the distance, I highly encourage you to walk up and have a look at it, because it'll be different than the next tree stone just a block over. They're all very different. There was a lot of things to mix and match on these tree stones. They were part of that Victorian rustic movement, so there's a lot of flora and fauna references on these tree stones, but they're all made of an oak tree, and the oak symbolizes strength. And so you'll see this oak tree kind of cut off, which symbolizes that idea that a life was cut short. sort, or a life was ended with this oak tree. And it has branches that are also kind of sawed off. So that also continues that idea that this life was ended. They are often associated with the fraternal organization called the Woodmen of the World, or the Modern Woodmen of America, but they didn't have to be. So you can, if you were just a mason and you wanted a tree stone, you could get one. If you were just, Joe Blow, who didn't have any affiliation with a fraternal organization at all, you could get a tree stone. So it didn't have to be, you didn't have to be associated with one of those fraternal organizations. But oftentimes the woodmen really were called to have a tree stone as their monument. So like I said, none are the same, and so there's all different varieties. There are some similarities. Most are, like I said, an oak, and then they have that scroll to showcase the name of the person when they died, and their death dates, maybe sometimes an epitaph if there's room. And then there's all these different symbols, like the fern on this one. The fern symbolizes humility. This one also, it's really hard to see, but there's a symbol of the Elks, the Fraternal Order of the Elks on this one. There's also, you can barely see it, but there's a little bit of ivy kind of wrapping itself around this tree stone. On this one over here, you see the symbolism for the Modern Woodmen of America with the axe, which was one of their important symbols for that organization. But then you also down here see the calla lily right at the base. And then on this one in the middle, you can see the branches are kind of broken, but you can see the oak leaves at the end of the branch. You can see the fern, and you can see an anchor. And we're going to talk about anchors a little bit later. What you can't see, which is really cool, you can barely see it. On this one, there's a little owl peeking out. So go up and check out a tree stone. They're always really fun to see and to see what's on them. Inverted torches are beautiful to me. I love the idea of the inverted torch. And the inverted torch, there's a lot of inverted torches here in Butte. I've noticed these most in Butte of anywhere else in Montana. I don't know if we have, I think we only have a couple in Bozeman, but here they're everywhere. And I think one of these pictures is taken from, might be this one from the Mount Moriah Cemetery. But the inverted torch just basically means, if a torch is upright, that means life is lived. Upside down, inverted, means that life has been extinguished. But the immortal life is symbolized by this flame kind of licking up the side of the torch. So it means that the person's life is over here on the earthly plane, but beyond that, they are still living eternally somewhere else. So that's kind of what that means, with the little flame kind of still represented there. And drapery is really reminiscent of this Victorian time period. And so this headstone is in the Bozeman Cemetery, and it's got beautiful drapery. So I love to showcase this one. You can see the drape here, the fringes, the tassel kind of hanging down. This must have been a master craftsman who did this headstone. It's not signed, so I don't know who did it. Sometimes the stone carvers would sign the headstone, and it's usually at the bottom, so always look for that signature. This one is not signed. But the drapery is interesting, and of course, if you think of a Victorian house from the 1980s, or not the 1980s, the 1880s or the 1890s, you often think of all the knickknacks in the house and the velvet curtains and the drapery everywhere. Well, that was represented on the headstone as well. So some of these things from the house, from the home, are transported onto headstones. Even thinking about that idea of little gates around the tombstone, that really represents that idea of the gates around your house. And you guys still have some beautiful iron gates or iron fences here in Butte. And also those are represented in some of your cemeteries here as well. So a lot of the ideas of home were also present on headstones. So the drapery is one of those things. And the drape was kind of that idea of the cutoff or the curtain between life and death. So you know that saying, it's curtains for you. That kind of is symbolic of that idea of, on one side of the curtain is life, on one side of the curtain is death. And the play is over when the curtain draws to a close. So that idea. Urns. This is from a headstone in Mount Moriah Cemetery as well. And you can see the draping below the urn, and then the urn is right here. And urns were really popular in the Victorian period, which is fascinating because the urn represents, it's very much a Greek, it's taken from the Greek culture, as are the columns and a lot of the things we see in cemeteries. But the urn was something that they would put the Greek soldiers' cremated remains in. And so that urn kind of has transported to Victorian times, but Victorian people really did not like cremation. They wanted a body buried. So it's interesting to me that they kind of used that idea of the urn that was supposed to hold the cremated remains. Of course, the urns in our cemeteries today do not hold cremated remains. They are just an architectural aspect of the headstone, but a beautiful one. And this one has a wreath of roses around the top of it, along with the draping of the urn. And the draping also represents that idea of sorrow. And when we're grieving, we're kind of draped, and so that's that idea as well of the draping. Represents that sorrow that we feel at the loss of a loved one. Okay, and so now I'm coming to the anchor. And the anchor has, well, let me just ask you, what do you think the anchor stands for? Oh, I set it up there already, so sorry. But the anchor, you would think, I think all of us in this room would probably associate that with the Navy or with maritime in some form or fashion. Well, in the 19th century, the anchor was a symbol of hope. And the reason for that is because there were three theological virtues within the Christian religion, which were charity, faith, and hope. And the anchor was the one that's the thing that symbolized the virtue of hope. And so when you see an anchor on a headstone, don't think water, think hope. In the Victorian time period anyway. Today, if you saw an anchor symbolized on a headstone, you could probably go ahead and figure this person was maybe associated with water, Navy, ocean, seafaring, or something to that effect. Okay. Now, I would be remiss to not talk about fraternal organizations, because if you go into any cemetery, you're going to see some amazing symbolism that represents a fraternal organization. And so when I talk about fraternal organizations, most of the time what probably comes into your mind is the Masonic Lodge or a Masonic Lodge or the Masons. And so how many of you have heard of the Masons? Probably most of you. How many of you have heard of the Oddfellows? Okay, good. How many of you have heard of the Knights of Pythias? Okay, good. That was a big organization here in Butte, yeah. So in this time period, there were thousands of fraternal orders, and they were very significant here in the West, because as people were moving here to this place where they had to create cities and towns out of nothing, these fraternal orders and the networks represented within those fraternal organizations were key to making a living in this place, and key just to having some fellowship with your neighbors in these places. So they were really significant, and we see that in our cemeteries. And so I just wanted to put a few up here, but if you go into the cemetery, you'll see so many more of these symbolisms and these fraternal organizations represented. So this one right up here, we'll just start over here, represents the Oddfellows. And so a lot of you raised your hands that you've heard of the Oddfellows. And the Oddfellows have this 3-link chain on their headstones often. They have a lot of other symbolism as well, but the 3-link chain is kind of the most prominent. And sometimes within each of these links, you'll see F for friendship, T for truth, and L for love. So you'll see within this F FTL within, and it might be in this one, you just can't see it very well. So the Oddfellows were very much like the Masons, and a lot of these organizations at this time also had death benefits. So you joined the Masons to have fellowship with other people in your community, but you also often got death benefits, which they would maybe pay for your funeral or pay for your headstone. So that was definitely a benefit. And so if they did that, you were more than likely going to put their symbol on your headstone, right? So, so that's the Oddfellows. This is the Daughters of Rebecca, which is the auxiliary, the women's auxiliary of the Oddfellows. And so this symbolism is a crescent moon with 7 stars, a dove that symbolizes peace, and then the R for the Daughters of Rebecca. And the Daughters of Rebecca have some really cool symbolism that is a little different than this too. So if you ever are out looking and you see the crescent moon with the dove, you can bet that's the Daughters of Rebecca, but they have all sorts of other stuff they add in. So it's really fun to kind of try to decode these things. This is the Knights of Pythias that I mentioned. And so you'll see that this is kind of a triangle, and that symbolizes that idea of the Holy Trinity as well. And then this one is friendship. You can see the F there, benevolence and charity. So that's kind of their keystones. This, of course, down here is the Masons, and that's probably the one we see the most. And this is the compass right here and the square. And then the G in the middle that symbolizes God and or geometry. And that, I was told that by a Mason. Do we have any Masons in the room? Oh, no, we don't. Okay, I thought we might. Well, I was going to say go to ask them more about it at the end of the talk, because I don't know a whole lot about the Masons. But there was Masonic sections in cemeteries. There were Oddfellow sections in cemeteries. So they would go in and buy a whole section of the cemetery for their people to be buried within. So this is just a little smattering. There's a lot more fraternal symbolism out there that's really fun to figure out. Okay. Broken column. This isn't vandalism. Well, sometimes it is, but in this case, it's not. This one is actually broken or made this way to symbolize the idea of a life cut short. So this is when someone died young, that you would put up a column like this or a pillar like this that's broken. And this one is in the Mount Moriah Cemetery. And Lindsay, is this one on your walking tour?
It's not.
No, okay. All right. Maybe. I was thinking this was one that had a kind of a lurid story behind it, but maybe it isn't. But anyway, this symbolizes, like I said, a life cut short. And so you might go into a cemetery and think, oh no, the cemetery's been vandalized, but look closely because they are made to look like this. White bronze. This is, these are spectacular, aren't they? Have you seen white bronze? Yeah, so some people have. Look for these in your cemetery because they're often still in very good shape. And they have, and like the tree stones, not one is the same. So all of them are very different. They mixed and matched panels on these white bronze or zinc headstones. So this is basically zinc, but they wanted to fancy it up, so they called them white bronze. These were popular between 1873 till about the time of the First World War, when all metal went to war efforts, and so they kind of stopped making these during the First World War, and then they kind of lost their popularity, and we never really went back to having these white bronze monuments. But they were mostly made by the Monumental Bronze Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so you would often ship these out to Montana. And they were much cheaper to ship because these are hollow. And so they're not as heavy as a granite headstone. And so they were a little bit more economical sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And they looked very nice. And they looked like granite. They looked very expensive. But you can see all sorts of symbolism. We have the wheat sheaf, we have the drapery with the tassels, we have a dove on the top. I think that's just a bunch of flowers, roses. And I'm not really sure what this is, but this is probably has some symbolic meaning as well. If you read down here, sometimes they say, and I've never talked to anyone who's done this or heard oral history of this, so this is kind of one of those urban legends, so take it as it comes. But during Prohibition times, they say that people would stash their liquor bottle in these white bronze headstones because you could just screw this little panel off, put your bottle in there, screw it back on, and then when you needed a nip, later on, you'd go back to the cemetery, sit there, have a drink, put it back, stash it back in. So who knows? But that's one of the stories that I keep hearing. So these were really beautiful headstones, and they had a catalog that you could order. You could go through the catalog and you could say, I want this and this and this represented on the headstone. And so this is the catalog from the Monumental Bronze Company. So you can see a lot of the symbols we've talked about already today. The clasped hands, the heart in the hand, the odd fellows. There's also the skull and crossbones, which you see a little bit of here in Montana in the West, but not a whole lot. The Masonic Women's Auxiliary, this is their symbol. Let's see, the Masons, of course, right here. So there's a lot of different symbols you could choose from to have, and that's why none of them look the same, because you had all these options, which is kind of fun. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about some really beautiful artwork. I mean, all these headstones we've seen today have been pieces of art, haven't they? And these monument carvers who carved these headstones did an amazing job. And if they were carved out of marble, we kind of today have lost some of the beauty of these monuments because marble tends to disintegrate. But we still have a few examples. And this one is called the Tufted Armchair Monument. And this was a popular monument for children that died young. And so it's very sad. It's a sad one as well. But you see this throughout Montana. I've seen it. This one is from the Mount Moriah Cemetery, but there's one in the Missoula Cemetery. There's one in the Deer Lodge Cemetery. So you'll see them throughout Montana. And we had a monument maker that lived here in Butte and worked in Butte and Helena, and his name was, Alonzo Prescott. And Alonzo Prescott, this was kind of one of his that he liked to do, and he was very good at it. But he wasn't the only person who carved these kinds of monuments. Other monument carvers did this as well, but this was kind of his specialty. So you'll see on this tufted chair monument, the little chair, and then you'll usually see a hat, and if it was a boy, it usually represents the boy with a baseball cap instead of the sun hat, which I think represents a little girl. You'll see the coat kind of thrown over the chair, and then you'll see little shoes, and then the little socks kind of rolled down and the shoes taken off. And basically what this symbolizes is that the little boy or girl came home, maybe from a day out playing, and they took their shoes and socks off, and they put them next to the chair. They took their hat off and their coat and laid it all there, and then for whatever reason they passed. And so it's a very sad idea of this little child never putting those shoes back on or putting those socks back on. And so this one is for the Warren family. They had 2 children who died, and so this is the monument for those 2 children. And this is another headstone that you'll see throughout the West, but we have a lot of them in Montana. And this is kind of the same idea. And Prescott did a lot of these as well. And we call them the socks and shoes stones. And that's, it's just kind of a minimized version of the tufted chair. So you see the little shoes, and you see the little socks that are kind of laid over the stone. And this one is in the Bozeman Cemetery, and it's for a little boy who died when he was about 5.5 years old. His name was Jamie. And and it's in really good condition. Even though it's starting to fade a bit, it's in much better condition than a lot of the other socks and shoes monuments that I've seen throughout Montana. So these really represent grief, don't they? They really represent that idea of a grieving family. So that we've kind of come to the end of the presentation, and so I kind of want to just kind of wrap up by talking a little bit of a conclusion about what we've seen just in this presentation today about what the values are and how the values are transmitted to us of these people who lived in Montana in the 19th and 20th centuries. And one thing that we've noticed today is that the environment was really represented well in these headstones. We see a lot of plants, we see a lot of flowers, we see a lot of symbols of the natural world incorporated into these headstones in a lot of different and various ways. We also see belief system, don't we? So I showed you, like I was talking about earlier, that a lot of Christian symbolism, but we also have a lot of other belief systems represented on headstones throughout Montana cemeteries and cemeteries in the West. We also see art and culture represented, don't we? And that's I kind of showed that through the Gates Ajar, that idea of literature represented through that book, then kind of playing out in these headstones. But really, if you think about it, in the 19th century, people read a lot, and they often read poetry, and there was a lot of these ideas represented, the Greek architecture, the flowers, that idea of kind of the weeping willow. A lot of those things come from literature, and so we see those expressed on the headstones as well. And then fraternal organizations, which really kind of speaks to that idea of community and what was important to them as they were building these towns here in the West. And then, of course, kind of went throughout this whole conversation was that idea of grief and the symbols of grief. And so all these symbols kind of culminate into that idea that people were grieving their loved ones as they were having these monuments made for them. So kind of thinking about that, thinking about those value systems, I have some homework for all of you to think about. And as you leave today, I want you to think about what you would have expressed on your headstone if you decide to have a headstone placed when you pass. Of course, we're all going to die. I hate to be morbid, but it is the way it is. And so when we die, and if you are buried, what would you have on your headstone? What kind of symbol would you put on your headstone to kind of express your value system and what is important to you? So I just want you to think about that. My second part of the homework is I want you, when the snow clears, I want you to go out into a cemetery here in Butte or wherever you're at. Every place has one. Go out into a cemetery and kind of look at the symbols on the headstones and see what's there, but also go into I talked just about historic sections of the cemetery today, but I encourage you to go to the modern part of the cemetery because the symbolism there is crazy. There's so much more symbolism on modern headstones. And I don't like to bring those in because who knows, they may be family members of the people I'm talking to. So I kind of stay in the past. But I encourage you to go look at those headstones because they have we have the laser capabilities that we have today can make some beautiful headstones. So I'll just end with this headstone, which is personal to me. So this one isn't here in Montana at all. This is in Wisconsin. And I took this when I was visiting my grandmother's grave. My grandma's grave is just next to this one. But this is a family member's headstone, the Brunner family. My last name is Bauer, very German, in this little town in Wisconsin that really is a dairy farming town. That's what it is. And so this captured my attention because of all the symbolism on this headstone. You can see what was important to these folks, can't you, by what's on their headstone. You can see they raise a lot of corn in Wisconsin. And so this is a beautiful cornfield. You can see their dairy farm here with the silo and the barn. And you can see the tractor right here. You can see where they live, their house and their outbuildings. Over here you can see a deer. Maybe they were hunters or just enjoyed the wildlife around their farm. You can see the ring symbolizing their marriage, which was important to them, and then it says loving parents, so you know that they had children. You know, you could, even if you didn't know this family, you could learn a lot by their headstone. So I encourage you, like I said, to go out and look at these headstones and think about what you would put on your headstone. So these values that we can see in these cemeteries really tell us a lot about the community of the 19th century, but also can kind of tell us about the community of today. Can talk about the lives and deaths of the people who once lived where we now call home. So while you're out there in that cemetery, make sure to enjoy the birds singing, the flowers, smell the flowers, enjoy the beautiful art, and enjoy the history that is part of these beautiful outdoor museums. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening today, and I'm glad to answer some questions.